Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing well.
Good.
Yourself?
I am doing wonderfully. I'm looking forward to our conversation about Donald Trump. Let me introduce us. I am Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Sarah Posner, familiar to viewers on both Blogging Heads and now Meaning of Life TV, which is where you're appearing even as we speak. And you are a writer. You've written for Washington Post, Rolling Stone, Religion Dispatches. You recently had a piece on in the week that we will probably talk about Donald Trump and Republican Jews. People may wonder what we're doing talking about Donald Trump on Meaning of Life TV, which generally deals with, matters of, about values, spiritual issues, and so on. But first of all, I would say Donald Trump clearly provides meaning to a lot of his supporters. I mean, it's nearly a religious thing with some of them. There's that.
Right.
There's also the fact that I think it's always a good, even you could say spiritual exercise to try to put yourself in the shoes of people who have a very different perspective from your own. So I'd like to try to figure out if we can imagine what is going on in the heads of Trump supporters and what is the source of the appeal. Because I think it's safe to say that neither you nor I feels especially drawn to Donald Trump.
I think that's fair to say.
Is that I was not being too presumptuous when I spoke for you on that one, Sarah?
No.
Okay. So what do you make of this? What do you make of this thing? You've written about it a little, and we're all paying a lot of attention to it.
Well, I have to say, having spoken to some Donald Trump supporters, and obviously, this is no ethnographic research where I've talked to a lot of them, I get the sense from the people that I have talked to that he gives them some sort of solace that he is going to protect America as they know it, and that he is the only candidate with the strength and fortitude and guts to do that. And it's funny because I think that demonstrates his mastery of controlling the media narrative about himself, because there's no real, it's not like, yes, he hasn't been involved in politics, but he's been in the public eye for decades, especially if you're from New York. Mm-hmm. He's a familiar name even before Celebrity Apprentice and all of that. So it's not like there's no record there, even though there's no political record, political office holder record like we normally are used to with someone running for president. And there's no evidence in his entire life story that he's capable of protecting America from whatever concerns you might have. I think that people have various concerns about how America might be seen as under threat right now. And there's no evidence that he could protect America under any of those scenarios. So it's a little difficult to fathom even putting yourself in his supporters' shoes.
Now, when you said, I think you said they think that he can preserve America as they know it. Is it that, or they think he can resurrect an America that either did exist or that they think existed and that would be better in their minds than the one they've got?
Well, yes, I think it's a little bit of both. I think that's, for some of them, they can't accept that America has changed, right? They can't accept demographic changes. They can't accept changes like we have a Black president. I think that for a lot of people, that is the clear undercurrent of what they're talking about when they say "Make America Great Again." Mm-hmm. They're hearkening back to some time before we had a Black president. It's other things too. It's before we had immigration. It's before we had a significant Muslim population. The list goes on of the things that he's hearkening to when he talks about that.
Right. There are these various variables correlated with support for Trump. He gets the most support in places where things are not going great economically for white males, especially less well-educated white males.
Right.
And I think in places where there are, some social pathologies afflicting that demographic, like drug addiction,
Uh-huh.
Apparently, one good predictor of support for Donald Trump is how low the life expectancy for white males is in the area. There's an inverse correlation between support for Trump and life expectancy for white males. So, I mean, you didn't allude explicitly to the economic plight of these people, I think, but that's commonly thought to, and I'm not sure it's true, but that's commonly thought to be a prime mover, one of the prime movers here, right?
I think it is, but I think that also, I mean, there's been political science research done on this that shows that an affinity towards authoritarianism
Right.
drives Trump's support. So I think that one of the issues with trying to untangle the multitude of reasons for people's support for Trump is that he himself conflates a lot of things. He conflates and he's unspecific about a lot of things. So when you listen to one of his campaign speeches, he'll sort of mash together China, immigration, build a wall, China, and it's kind of a word salad of various things where within moments of each other he'd be talking about ISIS, Mexico, and China, all of the and trade. And so all of these things are triggering different responses from his supporters. They might be having sort of an economic reaction to that because, my job in the manufacturing sector has gone away. So the trade thing, and maybe it was taken away by an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
And then, our open borders have made us susceptible to ISIS. And so like all of these things kind of get mashed together in a not particularly coherent way. So I think, I think for a social scientist, it might be a little bit of a challenge to like unpack all of that.
Yeah. I do think there are, I mean, as far as the authoritarian goes, that is the argument in this, I think, Washington Post piece or something was that there's long been a standard test that psychologists administer on authoritarianism to just see how drawn you are to authority, how much you value like order and strength and authority over things like liberty and so on.
Uh-huh.
And the argument was that how you do on this test is a stronger predictor of whether you'll support Trump than any other variable you can come up with. And that's interesting because authoritarianism, I think it's long been treated almost as a dimension of personality as if it's almost fixed, but at the same time, as the article noted, it is amped up by fear.
Yeah.
And what that leads me to think is that we should distinguish. I mean, when I think of that, the kind of fear that would feed into authoritarianism, I'm thinking of like ISIS and like, not so much fear of losing your job, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, maybe they both work in that direction, but I've got to think that a big part of this, as far as the authoritarian goes, is, the Fox News treatment of the war on terror for more than a decade now, and the constant sense of threat and peril that is way out of proportion to what the statistics say about the chances of any one American ever actually dying in a terrorist attack.
Right.
And so I think I kind of think of it, and of course this also maps onto the ethnic groups that Trump has said the most explicitly negative things about it. In other words, if you divide the issues into like fear of terrorism, you've got Muslims,
right.
And we know what he said about them. And if you think about economic issues, you've got immigration, and we know what he said about Mexicans. So I tend to think that those two things, the economics and the fear of terrorism, could together account for certainly a fair amount of his rhetoric. And now, and I guess a fair amount of the psychological appeal. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't discount also the way he deploys his critiques of political correctness, because I think that has a lot to do with the way conservatives have the sense that liberal or progressive or secular or feminist
Right.
or LGBT, whatever it is, values have taken away some sort of traditional America. And I think that notwithstanding the fact that Trump has a lot of critics within the conservative movement who have also beaten that anti-political correctness drum, right? So like
Hmm.
you have National Review devoting an entire issue to opposing him. You have a lot of evangelicals, even though Trump has a lot of support from evangelicals, he has a lot of opposition from evangelicals. They share this disdain for things that fall under the general rubric of the dreaded political correctness. Yet, um, yet not it doesn't cause all of the people who share that disdain to follow him. But I still think that that political correctness. I think what he's done is like he's tapped into like all of these different triggers on the
Hmm.
right. You know, the political correctness, the immigration, guns, you know, so like there's a whole list and he hasn't done it in a particularly coherent way, but it's almost like he's throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Hmm.
And he's cleverly done it to tap into the very things that you're talking about, like that Fox News has beaten the drum on for more than a decade, but doing it in his own way. Like he's not a he's not just like mimicking Bill O'Reilly, and he's not just parroting the words of Rush Limbaugh, but he's tapping into all of those sentiments that those figures have created over many years.
Right. And on the political correctness front, I mean, that's, I think, an interesting thing to think about. I mean, there is, on the one hand, a superficial kind of form of aversion to political correctness. And by that, what I mean is, I mean, I think of Howard Stern here. And by the way, Mother Jones, you may have seen, just ran a piece about noting they dredged up a conversation between Howard Stern and Donald Trump, where Donald Trump said something, super cheesy about Jennifer Lopez, part of Jennifer Lopez's anatomy or something. You know, it was one of those conversations that you would imagine that Donald Trump would have with Howard Stern. But
Right.
the other reason I think of Howard Stern is years ago, I remember my brother-in-law and I were talking to probably my wife and my sister-in-law or something. But anyway, they were like, what do people see in Howard Stern? And my brother-in-law and I agreed that part of it was there's a lot of things that people feel like, guys mainly, they want to say or are used to saying or think are true that they're suddenly not allowed to say, including that kind of talk just about women, like
Yeah.
two heterosexual guys like evaluating a woman or something, the way two heterosexual women might evaluate a guy or two gay people might evaluate whatever. Um, and I said, I think part of it is just like they feel like repressed, and that is, on the one hand, a pretty superficial complaint. That's a pretty sounds like a pretty minor complaint. But if you are in the demographic we're talking about, and your wages haven't grown, and you may have even lost your job, and on and on, and the people you see on TV enforcing this speech code are the very people you think have basically deserted you because they're the ones who favor free trade, and maybe they support affirmative action, and you blame that on something or other, for something or other. And they're the people you think identify more closely with their fellow elites in Europe than with America. Then it's easier for that to become, it's, in other words, the political correctness is associated with the people they would resent anyway.
Right.
And so it all kind of works in synergy, I think. I mean, that's a hypothesis I'm throwing out.
That's an interesting point. I also think that um, Trump's uber masculinity, we might call it that,
Yeah, we
has
might. Or
disarmed.
pseudo uber masculinity, but we won't go
Okay,
there.
right, has disarmed the Republican Party
Hmm.
because the Republican Party um, dislikes feminism and what it perceives to be the political correctness codes enforced by feminism, right?
Hmm.
Yet it sort of chafed under the charges that it was waging a war on women, during the 2012 election, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so it likes to think of itself as, at the same time, a anti-feminist, but not crude kind of party. So they're against the feminists, but they wouldn't want to see their nominee going on the Howard Stern show and saying crude and vulgar things about a woman. Yet that's what they've got, and I think that it has disarmed the party in a way. I've written about this, that he stole their machismo, and they have struggled to keep up with that. So when you saw Marco Rubio, making jokes about
Right.
Donald Trump's small hands, Donald Trump just like completely emasculated him, even in his effort to emasculate Donald Trump, right? Like Rubio's effort to go after Trump on that front failed because he wasn't really actually very good at playing that game. And so even though that sort of crude vulgarity is very prevalent among American males, and you would think that that maybe that would be an easy game for the Republican Party to play, it turned out that they weren't very good at that party in the face of very good at that game in the face of Trump, who has basically consolidated his his ability to be the uber masculine candidate, and that little Marco and Lion Ted, like everybody else, is just kind of diminished in the face of how macho Trump is.
And this has been the surprise to me, and the thing that I'm struggling to understand as I try to put myself in the head of the average Trump supporter, is that before all this, I thought, this is partly because I think I have this narrative of myself that I came from the real America. Because my parents were from farm families in Texas. My father was in the Army. It's we traveled around, series of, nondescript suburbs or living on military bases, and, hung out with kids. I always felt, so then I came east, and it's and I'm kind of thinking that the people I'm meeting, and so the elites in the East, don't understand the real America. I do. This was the myth that I sustained until Donald Trump. Because one thing I would have thought was true of kind of, quote, the real America, is that there was this kind of common definition of a jerk, right? It's okay, there are differences in values between the heartland and the relatively uneducated people in the heartland and the elites in the East Coast, but they don't like a real braggart. They don't like somebody who makes fun of disabled people, and they don't. There's just a level of crudeness that I thought was not favored by many Americans, and yet, I mean, that's been the mind blower. Because you can imagine somebody appealing to this constituency, certainly on the issues, anti-free trade, anti-this, anti-that, anti-political correctness, saying much of what he's saying, and yet not having the incredibly juvenile manner of expression, right?
Well, not juvenile, I would say frat boyish almost.
Yeah, I mean, not juvenile, because one thing I've said, have you seen the video where he's making fun of this disabled reporter?
Yep.
It is stunning. And I still think personally that it could be turned into a good attack ad if they juxtaposed it with the real reporter talking.
Yeah.
And say, this is the human being he's talking about.
Right.
But that aside, one thing I've said to people is look, I went to the public schools. I didn't go to fancy prep schools. In 6th grade in the public school I went to, a large majority of students would not have thought that was cool. Making fun of the guy like that, right? I mean, and that's why you're right. Juvenile is not even the word for it. It's like drunk frat boy.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
drunk frat boy on debauched spring break.
Right. It's the worst of the worst, and yet it's helping it. And I think at first I interpreted that. I thought a little of it was just that. Well, the more outrageous the stuff he says, the more evidence that is to people that he's not a real politician. And I do think that's part of it. Okay, this is not a thing a scripted politician says.
Right.
I think that's part of it, but it's just, it's gone so far, kind of, that I just think I misjudged Americans. I mean, or at least a significant fraction of Americans.
Well, I think there are a couple of things going on. One is that I think that he has mobilized the jerks
Mm.
in a way, like he has given legitimacy to people who are, who think it's okay to make fun of someone who's disabled, or people who think it's okay to tell somebody to go back to Auschwitz or someone to go back to Africa. These are video clips we've seen
Mm-hmm.
from recent Trump rallies. People who think it's okay to punch a black person in the face and then say, well, the next time I might have to kill him.
Mm-hmm.
These are things that actually happened at Donald Trump rallies.
After which Trump says he's thinking about paying the legal fees for the guy.
Right. Right. And, these videos went viral. The video of the white guy who punched the black guy at the rally in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
The guy who was yelling at protesters outside. I don't remember which rally it was, but, there's video of the guy saying, go back to fucking Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the video of the guy telling the black woman to go back to Africa. I think that for someone like that, and I'm not saying all of Trump's supporters are like that. I don't think they are. Mm-hmm. But for someone who is like that, they feel like they've been deprived of a voice, this like very twisted way. And they feel like, he has given them a voice, emboldened them, made them legit. So that's a really disturbing aspect, obviously, of Trump's appeal. I have met over the course of the months of the campaign, met many people who were troubled by Trump, Republicans who were troubled by Trump, but nonetheless admired, how he tells it like it is, how he's not afraid to just come right out and say it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think that for some people there were limits, so I met people back in December who said that, but, we hadn't seen the full extent of what Trump was capable of doing back in December. I was in South Carolina before the South Carolina primary, and I met a number of people who had liked Trump, and then he thought he had gone too far ultimately, and had decided to vote mostly for Cruz, but some for Rubio. And even on top of that, I met people who were supporting Cruz and Rubio and didn't really like Trump very much, but still felt he had contributed something positive to the campaign mm-hmm. by talking about the issues in the way that he had talked about them. And you see the effect of Trump on the other candidates, not so much on Rubio, but you definitely see the effect on Cruz. Cruz has a new campaign ad out in Arizona, which has a primary next week, and it's a total Willie Horton ad. It's it's this man whose son was tragically murdered, right? Nobody's going to argue that was horrible, but he's talking about how his son was murdered by an illegal immigrant. Mm-hmm. I mean, he uses that word. I wouldn't use it, but so that's a total Donald Trump play. He spent months talking about the woman who had been murdered in San Francisco by an undocumented immigrant. So, I think that there are some Republicans who say, oh, yeah, okay, he went too far with some of his antics, but, I'm perfectly happy to vote for a candidate who has adopted some of the central themes of his campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, another question is, I think there's an assumption on the part of people like you and me that there's quite a bit of bigotry in his constituency. I would say a couple of things, though. One is, of course, we shouldn't essentialize. When you see one person on a videotape saying, go back to Africa or something, that's not necessarily representative. Just as when one right. Muslim kills somebody, that's not representative of all Muslims, and we're always right. saying that, so we have to... we have to be consistent. And I think that's true. Of course, the most outrageous things are going to go viral on video. So, and they're not going to be necessarily representative. The other thing is, I think most people, almost all people like to think, they go around thinking that they're basically good. And I think even a lot of people who, we might see evidence of bigotry. They don't think of themselves that way. In fact, in the clip, the Go Back to Africa clip, it was interesting. The guy said, go back to Africa. And then it was almost as if he realized he was on video, because he kind of paused and added, if you don't support America, or if you don't like it here, or something like that. In other words, he wanted to be clear. He wasn't saying that all black people have to go back to Africa. Right? I mean, it reminded me once I was in Saudi Arabia, and this guy said something anti-Semitic. And I said, I kind of pushed him. I said, why'd you say that about Jews? And he said, I should have said Zionists. And he realized, he was like stepping back a little because he realized, he was under observation. But so I just am mainly saying I'm not assuming that all or most Trump supporters, are overtly, are in their homes always saying horrible things about black people, Jews, and Mexicans. I just genuinely don't know. I don't. Well, I'd like to know.
Right. I mean, I have met Donald Trump supporters who I have no reason to believe that they would say or any of those things. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, I do think that his rhetoric has, like I said, emboldened people who do think those things. I mean, because you see those sorts of things happening at his rallies, it's clear that, the man who sucker punched the other man at the rally in North Carolina, it's part of the package.
Yeah, he wasn't exactly shouted down.
No.
In fact, the sheriff's deputies thought that the guy to be subdued was the guy who'd just been assaulted.
Right. They have been suspended.
Right. I know, and
which is good.
Exactly. God bless that sheriff's office. I mean, maybe they should have been dealt with more harshly, but the main thing is that there was discipline.
But it's interesting because obviously there's the clip. Trump had said, I would like to punch him in the face, so I don't think that, he's not at that rally, but at a different rally. And, this goes back many, many months. It was at a rally in Alabama in November, Alabama of all places, right? Where there was a Black Lives Matter protester at the rally who, was, the press always uses the word escorted out. And I feel like escorted is not really the right word, but was removed from the rally. And Trump said, he should have been roughed up, or words to that, he used the words roughed up. And I think that produced some shock when it happened. And then it kind of disappeared for a few months. And that all of that didn't ramp up again until I think, there was the rally in Georgia where the Black students were forced to leave, even though they were just sitting there. But, I think we had a several-month period where there wasn't a lot of focus on what was going on at these rallies. And even though I don't think that sort of thing necessarily abated, I think there was this little spike back in November with that Alabama rally. And then it kind of faded from view, and then it ramped up again. But it was almost in line with the anti-Trump forces, feeling like, if we just let this thing run its course, the voters will see that he's not a good candidate. And then everything started to escalate or de-escalate too late.
Yeah. I mean, the media did note the kind of significant rhetorical escalations. Like when Trump first said, I'd like to punch him in the face. That was a story. Right. Yeah. That was reported, even though nobody punched that guy in the face.
Right.
So there was an understanding. I'm impressed in retrospect that was rightly seen as like a new threshold for a serious presidential candidate and worth noting because now we've seen the consequence. Right. Somebody actually got punched in the face.
Right.
And so there has been that. And what's interesting to me about this is that one thing is that, I'm sure many, many political candidates and people who have been heckled or whatever have felt they would like to punch the person in the face, right? I mean, that the sentiment is not exceptional at all. It's and the people in the crowd, if somebody's disrupting their entertainment, they're thinking, I wish somebody punched the guy in the face. That's not exceptional, but an important part of the American ethos and the ethos of any country that wants to remain a place where the rule of law is what governs, is that part of being a serious politician is you understand where the line is. And they're just things you really don't encourage. And in retrospect, I guess we should be proud of our public servants, because by and large, they don't say things like that.
Well, I think that goes to part of Trump's appeal, because I think that his supporters think that all the niceties of political campaigning are bullshit.
Right.
Right? And he has dispensed with all of that. And I think that's precisely why they like him. There are all these rules about, like, when you call your opponent to concede that you lost this primary to them, and when you hold a press conference, and when you do your victory speech. And, like, there are all these unwritten rules that, if you don't follow them, it shocks Chris Matthews and Wolf Blitzer. But, nobody else cares about them, right? And Donald Trump doesn't care about those things. He'll have a press conference at his, over-the-top, ostentatious golf club in Florida. And it's not really a press conference. It's just an opportunity for him to talk about how great he is and to berate the press. And he has gotten away with that. And I think that that's part of it. I think that because, I think that there's a ripple effect of the reality of politicians, like, being bought and paid for by mega donors and lobbyists, right? And that's a whole part of the package of, like, how we're supposed to act in political campaigns, and the protocol for this and that and the other thing. And I think that for many Americans, and I'm sympathetic to this, they feel very disempowered by that. Mm-hmm. It's just that Trump supporters have channeled that disempowerment into enjoying the spectacle of Trump thumbing his nose at all of that in a very Trump way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and when you say disempowerment, I mean, it's worth noting that these people may have more reason to feel disempowered than many Americans. I mean, if the statistics are true, and they're more likely to be unemployed or to have stagnant wages, and so on, to them, the system is not working for them. And, right. Liberals like you and me, if somebody says, the crime rate in this low-income black neighborhood is whatever, we might be inclined to say, well, one way to solve that would be to make the system work for these people, so that there's less sense of alienation from the system, and less, and in cases where the crime is about getting money, less need to do that. And I guess you have to say the same thing here. I think, it's worth paying attention to whatever set of circumstances give rise to a mass movement that I think people rightly consider a threat to basic American values.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, a lot of people have sort of compared the impulses of Trump supporters and Sanders supporters, which I don't necessarily agree with. But I do think that there's some truth to the fact that they're both tapping into a sense that the system hasn't worked, the system is unfair, the system is unequal from a financial, economic standpoint. I think that there's an element of truth to that, even though I think the dynamic of each candidate and each candidate's supporters is quite different. Mm-hmm. And obviously, Sanders hasn't played into xenophobia and racist fears and nativism and all of that. But I do think that it has a lot to do with, a sense of having basically been left behind. Now, I think the irony, obviously, is that Trump is basically an oligarch, and he hasn't been left behind.
Right. It's amazing.
That's one of the other amazing things about his rise. But I think he has figured out how to talk about these issues in a way that makes it seem like, look, I am the force that is going to lift everybody together to the place where I am winning and you're going to be winning with me, even though there's zero evidence that he's capable of doing that in any way. But I just think that, it's part of the, I just think that that's part of the way that he has appealed to people. He has, I don't know, like it's mystifying because, you think, okay, so like, are people sick of the Koch brothers? Are Republicans sick of the Koch brothers controlling their party? So, do they want, so they want their party to be controlled by Donald Trump instead? It doesn't
Yeah.
make any sense. But yeah,
No, well,
himself as a man of the people.
yeah, and the establishment Republicans don't want that, of course. But I also think one way he overcomes, I think part of the crudeness is a way of overcoming the fact that he did come from privilege, and he did get a big inheritance, and
Yeah.
he is very rich, and that's one way of relating to his constituency, and one reason that it doesn't weigh more heavily against him in their eyes, the fact that he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. I also think I alluded to the sense of that, the perception some elites may have more connection with elites abroad than with average American or American interests. And I think that's possibly significant and in a global way. I mean, we should remember this is in some ways analogous to things that are happening in Europe. These nativist, typically anti-free trade. Of course, in Europe, free trade is enmeshed in a whole system of transnational regulation. That's another issue, and that isn't so true in the United States. But whatever, Angela Merkel just did badly. Her party did badly in an election in Germany. And so, there is, and it is a fact that, Davos is a real thing. There are more and more connections among business class kind of people that cross national borders. And, if you look at like Silicon Valley, where all these rich people are, a lot of them are libertarians and are like open the borders,
Right.
and so on. And so I'm just kind of saying this part of it, since globalization seems to be a stubborn force, this part of it may not go away. I mean, we may be seeing the beginning of something that's going to confront a number of nations,
Right.
as citizens who are doing not so well economically perceive the more affluent citizens as betraying their country and being connected to and there is, Donald Trump hasn't played the black helicopters card yet, the UN, plotting to overthrow. He hasn't played the sovereignty per se card so heavily, but he probably could.
Yeah, but I think it's not in his DNA. I don't think. I
Right.
mean, some of these other things aren't in his DNA, but I just don't think that sort of Cold War era kind of conspiracy theory that
Yeah.
led to the
Although he was a birther.
the 1970s. I don't think that is. I
But-
don't know. Like, it's not really part of his mindset, and I don't think that he's internalized it in the same way that he's internalized some of the other right-wing rhetoric that he has internalized.
Right. Although his birther phase, however cynical that may have been, whether he believed it or not, it shows
Right.
he's willing to traffic in conspiracy theories.
True. I met this Trump supporter at CPAC, which was interesting because there weren't that many Trump supporters at CPAC because there was that whole controversy where he decided that he wasn't going to speak and he lost the straw poll there to Ted Cruz. And I did meet this woman. She was there with her husband. They were longtime CPAC attendees. They were probably in their 70s. He was close to 80. And I got the sense that she felt a little like alienated from CPAC because she felt that CPAC had a strong like anti-Trump
Mm-hmm.
element to it. And, she and her husband were not economically left behind. I had a very long conversation with this woman. She showed me pictures of her family and her home on her iPad. And, they were definitely not economically left behind. But she had this strong sense, and it was just a little bit, I have to say, it was jarring to me the way she said the reason she liked Trump was that she really felt like he cares about the people. And I found that a little bit stunning. Like she saw him as, like a benevolent dictator who
Yeah.
cared about the people. I mean, she didn't use that word, obviously, but the way she said he cares about the people just made me realize how effectively he had created this image of himself, at his rallies, the way he talks about, if one of his supporters calls out to him at his rallies, he'll like single them out and say, I love you too, and the way he projects that us versus them. I mean, it's really noticeable at his rallies if there's a protester and somebody who's yelling to him from the floor, "I love you, Donald," right? And the way he's like disgusting, dismissive of the protester, or he'll make some disparaging remark about the press. They're disgusting, they're scum. And then, typically a woman, will say, "We love you." And he'll be like, "I love you too." In this like very sort of like, "I'm looking right at you," woman from the audience who called out to me. And I think that that's been really, really effective.
Yeah, I hadn't noticed that. I mean, I heard him say, "I love the poorly educated. I love the evangelicals," which is another surprise to me has been how he gets away with like so overtly calculating the political consequences of what he's saying. It's not like he spends time actually trying to sound like an evangelical or be like an evangelical. He just says, "I'm leading among the evangelicals." It's just so overtly political. You'd think it would alienate the evangelicals. It's like,
It has alienated a lot of evangelicals.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, my theory about this, which I've written about, is that for one thing, the exit polling overcounts evangelicals, right? Because the exit pollsters go to a polling site in South Carolina and they ask somebody who's coming out, "Are you evangelical or not?" That's the question they ask. Are you evangelical? Yes or no? Well, like in some places, that's like asking somebody,
"Are you American?"
Are you American?
Yeah.
So I think that it overcounts, so obviously, like people are, it's a free country. You can say you're an evangelical.
Right.
Nobody is going to prevent you from saying that. But I think for a lot of evangelicals, they consider like a true evangelical to be somebody who like is a regular churchgoer, is very Bible literate and all the rest. I think that the exit polls are sort of overcounting evangelicals. That said, he still has evangelical support, even among people who are, fall into the category of regular churchgoing and Bible literate and all of that. But, there's a category of people that I call Trumpvangelicals, right? And Trump has basically succeeded in sidelining the evangelicals' traditional litmus test issues: abortion, same-sex marriage. Now it's the religious liberty thing, which is, the way of cloaking the loss of the same-sex marriage in a new light, of the same-sex marriage issue in a new light. He's completely sidelined those issues. I mean, yeah, sure. He'll say something like, "I'm very pro-life." I'm waiting for him to say, "I love the fetuses," but he hasn't done it yet. And he'll say stuff like, "We're not going to let them continue chipping away at Christianity. We're going to be able to say Merry Christmas with the president." But really, what the appeal to what I call the Trumpvangelicals is his anti-immigration, Islamophobia, and guns. This is, these are issues that matter to a great many evangelicals, but haven't been forefronted by evangelical leaders. And in fact, there are evangelical leaders who are supportive of immigration reform. And I think that that has caused a little rebellion below in the pews. And that's not to say that there aren't people in the pews who are for immigration reform, but I think that the leaders got ahead of their constituents in that regard. And I think that Trump has ignited a different kind of appeal to evangelical voters who maybe are thinking, maybe we shouldn't be so worried about the abortion stuff. I'm more worried about immigration and Muslims and the government taking away my guns.
So he actually may be moving the ball a little. I mean, really changing the landscape of opinion or emphasis.
I think he may be changing the emphasis and potentially changing the religious right's relationship with the Republican Party. Because if the religious right can no longer say to the Republican Party, "Oh yeah, we'll be able to get our voters to the polls if you, pledge to nominate Supreme Court justices who are going to overturn Roe v. Wade," or something, right? That's going to change their relationship. What's going to happen if the Republican Party realizes that the way to win elections is not by doing that, but by saying that you're going to ban all Muslims from the United States? Well, that's going to change things. Now, of course, there are Republicans who are not happy about that. They don't want to see that kind of change. And that's the sort of thing that could cause, the rift, the split, the crack up that people are talking about. But I don't know, how does a modern Republican Party, a modern political party that has an infrastructure and money and assets and, real things, not just an ideology, how does it actually break up and fracture? What happens? Like, what happens to its assets?
I think the assets presumably remain intact, and then there's a party that just breaks away. I mean, I would guess. I mean, it's like, it's not like divorce where one person gets the house and the other gets the Mercedes Benz.
Yeah, it just
but it could wind up that the what splits off is bigger than what remains behind, and of course we don't know for sure which side of that Trump would in theory be on. If he does not get the nomination, and the threat to riot does not get it for him, then he may be the splinter, the third party. Right. But if he gets the nomination, you may see mainstream Republicans start a thing outside the party.
Yep. I don't know. Yeah.
It's intense. Well, before we go, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about your piece in The Week recently about Trump and Republican Jews. That was about, 4 or 5 days ago?
Yeah, it was earlier this week.
So what's I guess ambivalence would be putting it mildly, the view of Republican Jews about Trump?
Well, I think that his appearance at AIPAC next week on Monday,
which is remarkable in a way,
it's really remarkable, is going to be telling. Now, I think that Trump has not only, on the one hand, Trump has alienated liberal Jews with his racism and xenophobia and all of that. Yet he has done very little tangibly to persuade Jewish Republicans who tend to be, extremely, pro-Israel, very hawkish on Israel, that he is on their side. He's like basically, committed heresy by saying that he's going to negotiate a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's not what they want to hear.
And I mean, he said, what was the term? It wasn't impartial, but it was like neutral between Israel and the Palestinians. Right.
I mean, that's not going to cut it with Jewish Republicans. Yet, I think that they're going to find themselves in a bind if it turns out that he is the nominee, right? Because they, AIPAC and groups like that want to maintain good relationships with the president of the United States, particularly if it's a Republican president of the United States who they expect to be on their side. The irony here is perhaps if there's a matchup between Trump and Clinton, that Clinton would, I would think that Clinton would be, if he sticks with this, I'm going to be neutral and I'm going to negotiate the best deal and all that Clinton would be a better pick for people in that camp than Trump would be when it comes to issues of Israel.
And with some of the foreign policy issues more broadly, I'm saying, hey, Putin's a great guy. We can, we can deal with him. Look, a number of neoconservatives have said they'll vote for Hillary. I think Max Boot has said that. Bob Kagan has said that. Now, I do think, though, I mean, when I said it's remarkable that AIPAC is inviting him, it's because, he's kind of thought to represent something anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic because, part of his base is kind of like white nationalist, and part of the white nationalist profile is anti-Semitic. But at the same time, when you look at things he's actually said, see, I mean, first of all, he hasn't said the things about Jews that he said about Mexicans and Muslims. No. I mean, he did say the thing that, he was speaking to a group of Jews and he said, some kind of cliched, some stereotype things like, you guys are great bargainers. I personally think that was just a misfire where he thought, sometimes the way friends demonstrate a bond by talking in a way with a level of familiarity and even kind of joking and so on, so you'll see two friends who are of different ethnicities say things about each other jokingly that you wouldn't say about somebody of another ethnicity if you didn't know. I kind of think maybe that's what he thought was going on.
I don't think so.
You don't?
I mean, I think I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I was there. That was the Republican.
Oh, you were there?
Presidential forum.
Did those lines not go over well?
I have to say that the reaction was sort of like, did he just say that? Right? Because I think that, and this again goes to like, if we give him the benefit of the doubt, if we give him the benefit of the doubt, it was a completely clumsy, uh, ill-advised thing to say to a Jewish audience.
Yeah.
And that goes to the, well, I'm not a real politician, right?
Right,
Because if a real politician, his aides would have read over his speech and said, maybe you shouldn't say that, right? So giving him the benefit of the doubt, it was bad politicking. And then worse, maybe he does, think that that's maybe he thinks it's kind of funny, but it's not funny, So I think,
but like, what is the upside of that? Because I doubt he was saying it for his constituency outside the hall. I doubt. You don't know, but
right,
because it wasn't overt enough, right? I mean, it wasn't like saying something negative about Mexicans, even if he thinks he has a lot of anti-Semites in his base.
Well, in the piece I did for the week, I described it as a sort of characteristic Trump mashup of insult and purported flattery, right? So,
right, you people are, there's a
like, you're a good negotiator.
He thinks of it as a compliment, maybe,
but maybe he also knows that it's not. It was strange. It was just odd.
It was,
and I think
there were
a lot of people. There were a lot of people who sort of said, "Oh, it's a little bit of an overreaction to consider that an anti-Semitic thing." But to me, it was sort of like, you didn't realize.
And was it
an anti-Semitic trope?
Was it there that he also said, "You guys don't like me because I don't want your money," or something like that?
Yes.
So that too, obviously.
But then he got booed for saying that he was asked a question. So they each gave a speech and then had a Q&A. And in the Q&A, he was asked, I can't remember if it was the question about moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or do you support, Jerusalem as the eternal undivided capital of Israel? It's essentially the same question. And he couldn't commit on that. And that just sort of seemed like, if you're running for the Republican presidential nomination and you're going to the Republican Jewish Coalition Presidential Forum, don't you know that one of the things you have to say is Jerusalem is the eternal undivided capital of Israel, and on my first day in office, I'm going to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's what Ted Cruz said, because he knows that's what he's supposed to say to that audience. So it's just kind of like, it was just sort of surprising, because obviously the audience didn't like that very much. And also sort of like, oh, didn't you, and it almost seemed to me like he went in there thinking, you know what? I don't need to pander to these people. I'm just going to go in there and say whatever I want. Now, next week at AIPAC, that might be different. There's already signs that that's going to be different.
Oh, I'm sure it's going to be different. And here's what I think about that. I mean, on the one hand, it's shocking or surprising maybe that AIPAC would welcome a guy who's, got these kind of fascist,
yes,
and anti-Semitic associations, whether or not we're reading too much into him, because it's not that explicit.
Right.
But on the other hand, I don't think the anti-Semitism is like an essential part of his appeal to his base, the way immigration and Muslims, and anti-Islam rhetoric is, and I think as for foreign policy, which is what AIPAC is most concerned about,
right,
I think he's totally up for grabs at this point. He doesn't, he says these things impulsively, but they're in contradiction with one another. I mean, one thing he said, on the one hand, he's sounding like some kind of realist who's going to, and non-interventionist or even isolationist sometimes. But on the other hand, they say, well, who do you like in foreign policy? Oh, John Bolton, And so, and AIPAC.
My own brain.
Plus, yeah. That was a remarkable set of sentences. I wish I could remember what he said when I listen to myself. I've got a good brain and I say a lot of things. You definitely say a lot of things. So anyway, I think, and I don't think his constituency, I don't think they don't think about Americans don't think about foreign policy much. And it's not like they'll hold it against him if he said he's pro-Israel after taking a little heat for saying he'd be neutral. So I think he's up for grabs, and I think he's going to realize AIPAC can choose to hurt him or harm him in a general election, and not just monetarily, but in terms of revving up opposition. So I don't think he's stupid, and I think foreign policy is an area where his political constituency does not constrain him all that much. I really don't think so. So I think you're going to see him move. It wouldn't shock me if by the end of this, Max Boot was saying, just kidding. I think the bellwether, I'm going to keep my eye on what Jennifer Rubin is saying. in the Washington Post.
I don't think she's a fan of Trump.
She's certainly not, but she used to talk this way about Cruz, and now she's saying Kasich should get out of the race so Cruz can win. Because the neocons didn't trust Cruz either.
About Cruz. Lindsey Graham endorsed Cruz, and Lindsey Graham had once said choosing between Trump and Cruz was like choosing between being shot and being poisoned.
Right.
So, I think that this is pragmatic, if it's that, on their part. But I think that from AIPAC's perspective, I think that a lot of the people who are going to object to Trump's being at AIPAC, it's starting, obviously, like you've got sort of, J Street and further to the left activists who are probably going to be protesting outside, right? Mm-hmm. And their protest is not that Trump is too hawkish on Israel, or that even that he hews to AIPAC's position on Israel, but more that, he doesn't represent Jewish values because of the xenophobia and racism and so on.
Right.
And then inside, there's going to be some rabbis who will not be in the room for his speech. Incidentally, will not be in the sports arena for his speech. So like the imagery of Trump, that some people have, compared to some sort of proto-fascist speaking to a Jewish audience in a sports arena is just, it's going to be surreal, I think. But there's going to be rabbis who are not going to be there for the same reasons as the lefty protesters outside. But I think that from AIPAC's standpoint, they're saying, okay, well, like we invited all the candidates, right? And that's what we do. We're nonpartisan. Mm-hmm. We don't take, we're not going to take sides. We're going to let all of the candidates have their say. I think if they backed off of Trump, that would probably be, it could be more of a political problem for them than just having him there. Because like having him there is not saying like we endorse him.
Right.
There are a lot of people who say, look, he's just beyond the pale. He's not like a normal candidate. But, he is the Republican frontrunner. So, I see both. I
didn't realize they invite all the candidates. So they do that systematically.
Yes.
And on the Democratic and Republican side?
Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. So it wasn't like they said, let's invite Trump and nobody else.
Yeah, well, then I can see how I'm much less surprised then if that's the policy. I didn't have that context.
Yeah. So Cruz will be there as well. I'm not sure about Kasich. Clinton will be there, and I guess Bernie Sanders is the only one who declined the invitation.
Did he really?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm trying to think that through. It would have been a fascinating spectacle if he had just gone the Trump line and said, screw these guys, and spoken to his base, and try to rev them up or something. But anyway, alas, we'll be spared that that spectacle. So yeah, well, I guess we're about out of time, and I don't know. The only thing I feel sure about is that we should do more of this in the sense of like taking seriously the fact that something there is a set of circumstances that created an audience for Trump, and we better figure out what it is.
Yes. Because
this is, you and I agree at least, this is not a healthy thing.
That's true.
Okay. Anything else you want to say on this or anything? Any pieces you want to plug?
I mentioned a couple of them while we were talking. The one I wrote about the Trumpvangelicals, that was at the Week, and the one I wrote for Rolling Stone about how he stole the Republican Party's machismo.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And remind us of your Twitter handle.
Just my name.
Just your name. No periods or anything.
No score or anything.
Okay,
yeah.
Good. Well, I know you let your dogs outside because last time we spoke, they played a larger role than you were comfortable with. Although I embrace this. I mean, dogs are much more entertaining than people.
Yes. Well, they're a little rambunctious.
Well, we have some of those too. But so now you can go and either frolic with them outside, it's a nice day, or let them back in and thank them on my behalf.
I will. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Take care, Sarah.